Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of LLF Online. My name is Iman Umar, and I'm delighted to be hosting and interviewing none other than Ms. Laleh Khadavi, who has joined us all the way from San Francisco. Laleh Khadavi is an Iranian-American author and filmmaker who was born in Isfahan, Iran. She is the author of the Kurdish trilogy consisting of her debut novel, The Age of Orphans, The Walking, and A Good Country. Her debut novel won the Whiting Award for Fiction, the Barnes and Nobles Discover New Writers Award, and an Emory Fiction Fellowship. Her debut documentary film 900 Women aired on A&E and premiered at the Human Rights Watch Film Festival. She has worked as director, producer, and cinematographer of documentary films since 1999. Her fiction and nonfiction can be found in the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, VQR, The Sun, and other publications. She is the recipient of a 2016 National Endowment for the Arts grant and a 2016 Pushcart Prize for her story, Wanderlust. She lives in Northern California. Hi, Laleh.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. I'm glad to finally make it, at least virtually, to the festival.
Yeah, and it's 7 in the morning for you, so relatively very, very early. What's the weather like in California at the moment?
Actually, today is pretty nice. Around this time of year, the weather gets kind of warm, but smoky because we have a lot of fires. And today's clear. I think the fires are small today, so nice. It's a good day. How about out there?
It's been raining a lot, so we have our monsoons, the monsoon months at this point of the year. So it's been raining a lot and just flooding and just, it's not very pleasant, but it is what it is.
It's good for reading.
It's very good for reading.
Yeah.
A lot of inspiration. So let's dive straight in. And I think right off the bat, I think it's safe to say that you have become one of the leading lights in sort of chronicling the Iranian-American immigrant experience through a fictional lens. So I just wanted to know more about how, the idea was conceived that you want to be a writer one day and why you chose to novelize the genre of migration.
Okay, so I guess becoming a writer wasn't something I always wanted to do. I had never really thought about it, and I wanted to be a political scientist and work in sort of large-scale global nonprofit world. I volunteered for some time at Human Rights Watch, doing human rights work. And then I made the films about the criminal justice system in the United States. And I realized that art, as much as policy, could make a change in people's perceptions. And so gradually I started to realize that the novels I enjoyed reading were not something that, aliens wrote. They were something that people like me wrote. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll try that. And growing up in the United States, I came here when I was 5. You get a sense that you're constantly explaining yourself, who you are, where you're from, what does your name mean? All of these ways in which people are curious. And I thought, if I write a book, maybe I won't have to answer those questions anymore, which wasn't the case actually. But the books it's a trilogy, and they were an act of storytelling as communication. So a way of bringing communities closer by telling stories that are, based in very common human experiences. And migration, I think one of the sort of difficult things about it is that the migrants have one story, and the places they go, the people who live there have another story. And the stories are not meeting. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of hostility. So that's why I went into writing about migration. I thought that is an area in which people actually need to communicate directly with each other through narrative and through the heart, rather than statistics about how many people are crossing borders and how many live in refugee camps. The actual individual stories are much more powerful and will open more doors than the headlines.
Right. So something that our audience may not know is that you have Kurdish heritage. And as a daughter of migration, they'd be curious to know a lot about, more about how it was like moving as a member of, as someone in the margins in Iran to the United States, which had hostile policies towards Iranians, and how your process was like in terms of fitting in to society.
Well, I mean, my father is Kurdish, and so I feel like he was on the margins in Iran to begin with. And so when he came to the United States, being on the margins was not unfamiliar to him. So it was something to be expected. Myself, you know, when you're very young and you move to a new place, I don't think you recognize what the margins are in that big socio-emotional way. You just see it in the playground, or you maybe see it in who invites you to their house, and who comes to your house to visit. And so it wasn't until I was older that I realized that there's a difference, there's a separation. There were certain places that I didn't go as a kid and certain things I didn't get invited to. And I think the United States is in a slightly different place, at least in pockets like San Francisco that are much more inclusive. But I grew up in smaller towns, like outside of Dallas or outside of New York City or, you know, Atlanta, where there was just a feeling of being on the periphery that it took a while to sort of understand. And then now we are commemorating, I suppose, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. There's a way in which 9/11 brought all of that to the surface. So whatever we might have thought was subtly anti-immigrant or subtly anti-Muslim was suddenly very obvious, which was a lot of the fuel of my third book.
Right, yeah. And how assimilated are you at this point in the United States?
Well, that's a very strange question. I don't know. I mean,
as in, did you travel back and forth with your family, with your mother or your father? So you might have, you know, picked up some of those values, you know, from, you know, collectivist culture, you know, warm, hospitable family values, as opposed to, you know, the individualistic culture in the United States. So do you think that you have a fusion of both, or do you ascribe more to here or there?
Well, let's see. I traveled back and forth a few times, some during the Iran-Iraq War. And so that was pretty intense. And whatever sort of communal or non-individualistic culture was a little bit shaken because people could not do their regular gatherings. People, I mean, there were blackouts and people couldn't safely have normal life. Then I went back again when I was in my 20s and got a sort of exposure to that kind of lifestyle. And at the same time, I've been raised in the United States. So many of my values are, in some sense, American values. But first of all, I don't feel like the American reputation of being individualistic is very true, but there is also community within that. It's just communities that exclude other people. They're inclusive to Americans and probably Christians and neighborhoods and values that may not be my own, which is true of the Middle Eastern, that sort of collective culture also. You know, it's very family-based and very class-based and excludes things on the fringes of its own. So I don't know, for example, we live with my mother right now, which is, you know, a very sort of non-American thing to do. And it's wonderful. And I'm so grateful that she's here with us. And on the other hand, I also want my children to be able to, you know, bring people into our home and into our life who we may not have known. inside of our family structure, inside of our collectivist structure, people from, outside communities. And so it's a balance. It's definitely a balance. And I think that my sort of Persian self works hard to resist the, kind of Calvinist Christian drive to succeed and not share and all of these other things. And then at the same time, my American self is constantly seeking ways to break through barriers of race and class and have inclusivity. So it's a mix, but all the Iranians think I'm American, so.
And all the Americans think that you're?
Immigrant.
Let's talk a bit more about your work and your book, since you mentioned that you go back and forth and you probably listen to a lot of stories of your relatives, of your family, friends, or friends that you've made there. When you're writing your books, what are your primary resources for writing what you write? So do you conduct interviews through which you develop characters? Do you read other books? How's it like for you, the writing process?
It depends on the book. So the first book was largely interview-based, Age of Orphans. I transcribed maybe 500 pages of interviews. And then there was a lot of research that went into understanding how Iran went from being a congregation of tribes to being a state, a nation. And how much of that was because of the British and the French. What that transition was like for people, what it meant to go from having a, local leader to having some sort of figurehead president or king or shah. So that was really research-based and a lot of interviews. The second book was also a lot of research about just migration, human migration out of Iran into both India and the East, and also the West, the United States, and Canada, Europe. And then the third book was not a lot of research. I did a little bit of research, no interviews. I read interviews other people had done about young people who had turned towards extremism, especially young Europeans whose parents moved to Europe to give them supposedly better lives, and who then turned around and said, no, we'd actually like to be fundamentalist Muslims and join ISIS. And I thought that psychology was very interesting, but I couldn't find anybody who had gone through that experience to talk to. Some journalist had, and I got in touch with them and I was given access to interviews. But that book was largely one of the imagination.
So, I mean, from what you've said and from reading your books and, sort of listening to some of your interviews, I realize that you have this suspicion of the nation state, of patriotism, of nationalism. Do you want to talk a bit more about that? Shed more light on that?
I wouldn't say it's you could say suspicion. I think I'm skeptical.
Right.
I'm skeptical of any system of power that gives some people more access to power and wealth than others. And so if that's communism, I'm suspicious of communism. If it's tribalism, which tribalism also does that, and I'm suspicious of that. I think that the transition into nation states in the Middle East in the early 1900s was very arbitrary. And I think we are currently seeing the aftermath of that random, violent, unnatural move into the nation state. I mean, just looking at Iraq and seeing what happens when you remove Saddam Hussein from the equation, how fragile those systems are. And if you think about the relationship between states and migration, then you start to get a sense of what a nation state does and doesn't do. So, on the one hand, it's the border into which everybody is trying to enter or exit. And if you didn't have a nation state, then you wouldn't have a border. And then migration wouldn't be the issue that it is now. There would still be large movements of humans, and that would have to be navigated, but inclusivity, othering, belonging, all of those things would take on a very different tone. You know, humans have always found a way to us versus them, any given situation. But I think if you remove borders and you turn the nation state into something that's a lot more amorphous, then you have to negotiate the problems of migration in a cooperative way, rather than in a way that has to say, you know, my resources are on this side of this line and we don't have to share them with you. If the line is gone, then you have to navigate it in a kind of new way. They tried it in Europe, you know, they had the EU and they were attempting a non-bordered space, but, you know, it had its benefits and it had its drawbacks, which we can see with Brexit. So I think it's an evolving thing. I have a lot of ideas about it, but mostly they're questions. I don't have a lot of answers.
So this brings us to our next question, which is actually elemental to your work, and it's the concept or notion of the radical or radicalization. What does radicalization mean to you?
Well, in the beginning of my third book, I just put in as definitions, you know, what is a radical in chemistry and physics, a radical molecule, you know, and what does it mean in American slang when people are saying, oh, that's so radical.
That's so rad. That's what.
Yeah, exactly. It's so rad. I think it is something that steps out of itself and behaves in a unpredicted fashion. And in terms of, you know, the recent wave of radicalization, and by recent, I mean the last 20 years, I see that as people stepping out of individualized Western society and seeking a more communal religious experience of life, in which they are responsible to a group, in which they belong to a tribe. It's basically the reverse of what happened in the early 1900s, the movement away from the nation state into a much more sort of organic, informal conglomerate that's kind of tribal, and what that gives to people in terms of feeling included. The nation state left people out and put people on the fringes and on the edges. And this was a desire to bring people in. I mean, if the nation state had been able to accept everybody who came into its borders as its citizens without discrimination, we would not have had the problem of radicalization. But because it wasn't wholly accepting, the other problem is, on the other hand, when you radicalize, it's an extreme way of being. So you're casting off many values, many attitudes, to have belonging. You know, I think about like mafia movies and the way mafiosos, they're like, yeah, sure, we'll give you protection, we'll let you into our club, but you have to, like, once a year go kill somebody for us. You know, like there's a fine, there's a payment. And I think when you join any kind of radicalized group, you're giving up some of what you think may be right in terms of how you treat women, how you behave, the ways in which masculinity operate. But you're also, you know, you're being accepted. If you sign up for those values, then you will be accepted. It's like half a dozen, as they say, in one hand, and, you know, 6 in the other. Same thing, but different name.
And that really brings us to how you trace that fine line between identity and belonging. What do you have to say about that? What's your sort of interpretation or your view about it?
Well, I don't know, it changes, but I'm asking me at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, I would say, in this moment, the way that I see identity is that we are all looking for a place to fit in. So it's related directly to belonging. And we're all looking to fit in as we are. You know, so if you think about, for example, a trans person who wants to be recognized and accepted in their trans identity, but who is not, the rest of society is like, nope, you were born as a girl, you're just going to have to be a girl, we're going to see you as a girl, you're going to use all the girl bathrooms, we're going to refer to you as a girl. That person's identity, as they determine it, will never be able to relax, will never be able to feel accepted, will never enter into belonging. And in the absence of that feeling of being accepted, resentment is going to build, confusion, all manners of, like, you know, emotional anxiety. If you have an identity that, for example, you are born in the United States as a white Christian man, it's not going to be hard to find belonging. You can just wake up in the morning and go outside and everybody will think, oh, you belong here. And so that person undergoes a lot less psychic karmic stress than the first person I talked about. And it's hard because we're not a species that has come to believe in total acceptance yet. There's no reason not to. We have all of the technology, we have all of the you know, ways of extracting wealth from the planet and harvesting food, and we're not dealing with famine in huge ways, and we're not dealing with violence in the ways that we did 500 years ago. We're now, you know, able to turn and look at each other and figure out why it is we can't necessarily communicate or relate with the other. And I think for some communities, that's a hard conversation because the other threatens them. And for some communities, they're open to it. And this varies family by family, you know, neighborhood by neighborhood, country by country. I can have a good conversation with my neighbors perhaps about certain things, and then I go 2 blocks away and I bring up the same things and the conversation is very different. So I feel like humanity, and especially, you know, places with large immigrant populations, are in a dialogue right now that is not a comfortable one and may not be resolved anytime soon, but it's necessary.
Right. Okay. I'd like to focus a bit more about your writing and your work and the books that you've written. And in particular, I was fascinated hugely by The Age of Orphans and how you were able to create this sort of rich feeling of discomfort when this young Kurdish boy becomes the oppressor of his own people. So how did you feel when you wrote this? What emotions went through you?
Well, I was much younger. I didn't have children. And I was operating off the energy of all the powerful things that I had read. So, you know, amazing writing around violence and self-hate by American writers who dealt with race. And the model of the Black American was very helpful to understanding the psychology of a character like Reza in the first book. And I felt like I was doing the work of the artist who's able to put their emotions second and put the truth of the book first. So sometimes I felt very powerful and strong. And sometimes, like when I had to write the rape scene, or when I wrote other scenes that had like a lot of violence having to do with this character's destruction of self, I felt terrible and it was really hard. And I had to step away from the book and take care of myself. But what it does, I mean, it's not for nothing. It's not gratuitous. I think that the violence in the book helps to give a sense of how difficult it was to live in a country that had cast your entire tribal identity as, you know, backward or evil or not part of the modern state or to be suppressed. And how much of that do you buy into, and how much of that do you reject? So it was hard, but I don't think I could write that book now. I think that after having children, it's really hard to imagine that kind of violence. It doesn't come very easily.
No, it doesn't. It's definitely one of the few questions that I wanted to ask you, how it made you feel. And this question is also in relation to all of your other characters and all of the other books in the trilogy. When did you start thinking of these characters? And, they're all these powerful characters that, want to be seen or heard. So how is the process like? Thinking about them and, building on them?
Yeah, I think, I have somewhat of a social justice background, working for Human Rights Watch and then making movies about prisons. And I feel that the point of art is to give voice to the voiceless. And these characters are not people who are in the common conversation. Like a character like Reza in the first book is forgotten by history. Nobody remembers him. Nobody talks about his experience. And that's what art is for, is to go back there and dig through and try to bring forward these ghosts who didn't get the microphone, who are not going to be known in the history books, whose families after certain generations have died are not going to tell their story. So art has that big push into the future of a particular story. And the same is true for the second book, where Saladin, everybody talks about the great exodus of Iranian immigrants out of Iran before the revolution, as they will talk about the great exodus of Afghans out of Afghanistan, but nobody knows a name, and nobody knows an actual story. And I think that putting their story down as truthfully as you can in art was the push that I had. I tried to write in the beginning the female version of it, but I couldn't get access to the world. I needed to be able, when I tried to write the female version, I couldn't get my characters out of the house in a believable way, it was so frustrating. And so I thought, okay, let me try to write from the masculine perspective, and then they can go anywhere they want. And I realized that all three, the grandfather, the father, and the son, this masculine line that runs through was about writing global citizenship in the 20th and 21st century. And I feel like the women need their own set of books. That's a completely different thing, but I have to become a better writer before I write this.
Right. And is there any particular place or thing that triggers your imagination? For example, being in a public space or a private space, what's your go-to for writing?
Oh, I can't write in a public space. Right. I have to be in my room. No one can be around. I have to have my books. It's very specific. I mean, sometimes out of necessity, maybe while I'm at my kids' soccer practice, I will write in the car. But it's different. I need quiet and the ability to think long thoughts and not be interrupted. It's an old practice, writing and storytelling, and requires a kind of, humble devotion. And I think, I have a lot of friends who write in coffee shops, and they don't mind the sound of the espresso machine, and they can go into that place in their heads. But I treat it with a little bit more sacredness. I need to access a kind of quiet that our busy life does not encourage. But everybody is different,
I agree.
How do you write?
Just hours and hours of frustration, and just it's difficult to explain, because it's like, you get this idea, but I think the thing about writing is how you express it, which words and how you form those words. So, and I think that takes time.
Yeah, That does take time. A lot of it is the pursuit of the kind of confidence inside of yourself and quiet to let the words come rather than hammering them from your perspective into the shape you want, to move yourself out of the way and let whatever is needing to be come forward. I mean, I've taught writing for 15 years now, and I'm no better at teaching it than I was on day one. It's almost impossible to teach. My biggest advice is get out of your own way.
Right, and just do it. Is that your advice?
Well, sometimes you can't just do it. Sometimes you sit in front of a blank piece of paper or a screen for a day.
And hate yourself.
Well, you could, or you could just think it's happening in the back of my mind.
Yes.
It's happening in the back of my mind when I ride the bus. It's happening in the back of my mind when I wash my dishes. It's happening. It's all, and I just have to every day show up, and some days will be very fruitful and some days will not. And judging only makes it worse. But it's what I tell a lot of my students is that there's a lot of music inside of writing, and pay attention to the music. Like my first book is, my mother was like, why did you use all of these big words? Why did you just, and I was like, because they're so beautiful, you know,
They're beautiful.
Sound very musical to me. And it was the music that pushed the words, the story out, the language, the sound of the poetry inside of the story I was telling. Whereas for the third book, less musical, just all about plot, you know, I was trying different things. But the pleasure I had in writing the first book and the sounds of the language was what got me to make it. And so to find that thing that brings you pleasure, is it the plot? Is it telling the story? Is it your character? That helps.
So can you talk a bit more about your films and, you know, your career as a filmmaker, a director? Because that's something you did in the past. And would you like to talk about it?
Sure. I mean, I can talk a little bit. It was a long time ago. I've become 5 different people since then. I think I've always been drawn to human stories, and I made documentaries. So I wasn't telling my story. I wanted to use the camera to help other people tell their story. And when you get somebody to relax enough to be able to really say, you know, this is who I am, this is where I'm from, this is why I'm in this place where I am, it's a really beautiful thing. And it makes it impossible for you to judge them. And I wanted to use this huge media of, you know, filmmaking to make it hard. So people in prison have already been judged. And I wanted to get people to reconsider their judgment, or just to listen for long enough to realize that it's really hard to judge a person.
And whether they're telling the truth or not, how can you tell? How do you distinguish whether they're telling the truth or they're not? Or if you've been to Iran, you know, the whole concept of saving face, I think it's called Abru in Iran.
Abru, yes.
So how do you distinguish who's telling the truth and who isn't, and how does that contribute to your overall research and the validity of it?
Oh, well, it's very easy because so it's very different in the films, but in real life, when you go to somebody and you interview them, and especially if they don't want, you know, to lose their avru, that's interesting too. What is said is almost as interesting as what's left out. And when someone is doing a lot of work to cover up something that is shameful, that's a whole story right there. You know, you listen for what is not said. And truth is, you know, in its own way, a little bit subjective, but truth is not what the novelist is after necessarily when they're doing the interviews. It's what you want the book to get at. And so when people, I would speak to Iranians and I would listen to stories and I would read histories, especially because the histories are so, you know, if you were a supporter of the Shah, you told it like this. And if you were a supporter of Khomeini, you told it like this. And how interesting that 2 people can look at an apple and call it a different thing. And inside the spaces of the truth is where the story is. So the more people kind of didn't tell me the truth, the better it was for my imagination. I could sit and think, oh, well, why are you lying? yay, that's so much material right there, you know? But in the prison, I found it was very interesting. I found everybody to be very honest about who they were. You know, a woman had killed her husband after years of, you know, being beaten, and she explained it very truthfully, and there was no shame. And you got a sense of that step by step what drove her to an act. You know, I think, but that's an extreme. If you go, that's kind of like if you go to the people who have done life-changing things, they're more willing to recognize that than if you talk to people who have, you know, sneakily been in self-denial. I mean, self-denial, which results in lying, is a very fascinating human trait. And I think I spend a lot of my fiction kind of trying to understand it.
You mentioned that you've become five people right now. And are you focusing more on your craft as a writer or a filmmaker? Is there anything in the pipeline at the moment?
You know, I'm at a very interesting place in my life. Like I have 2 children and I love them, and they require some shepherding through life. And I have a full-time job. And so that takes, you know, I have often 40 to 60 students. So that takes a bunch of time. I have put filmmaking aside until I can figure out something that I can do that's not already being done wonderfully. So many great films are being made, so many wonderful documentaries. People know what to do with a camera. They don't even need a camera anymore. They can just take their phone. You know, that whole world is just open to people. And I support everybody go out and make the movies so that I don't have to make them, because they're exhausting and they take a lot of money. But in terms of writing, it is, you know, the person who wrote those 3 books, the person who wrote the first book was different than the person who wrote the third book. And the stuff that I'm working on now is being written by a version of me that, you know, is kind of grappling with living on a planet in climate change, and the fact that time, the nature of time, is going to be perceived differently as we live with more and more uncertainty. And thinking about migration and what it means, like we discussed today, for the sense of belonging and how that's going to change in the next 100 years as there are more migrants. And so these big questions, I feel, are just marinating in my head right now. And I'm giving them the space and the time to bubble up and see what comes. But I don't know, I feel like the writing that might come of it is not recognizable to me as a novel. You know, I wrote 3 novels in 11 years. I feel like that's pretty good. I'm not sure, I can't feel a novel around me right now. I feel poems and essays, right, and shorter pieces. But the novel seems like a very big, faraway project that requires a lot of time.
So you're enjoying teaching at the moment?
Yes, I do.
All the ideas from the youngsters around you.
Yeah, you know, I'm trying to support them on their journey, because as you know, writing is really difficult. And it helps to have somebody cheering in your corner, to tell you that, you know, just keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. I feel like I had people do that for me when I was starting, and that was very helpful. But the most important lesson I try to teach my students, which is so weird and hard, it has so little to do with writing, is just to relax.
Right.
I just need them to relax. Like, everybody needs to stop trying to sell a book, and everybody needs to stop trying to be famous and just relax. And, you know, it's only by relaxing that you'll be able to find the voice. And that's a really hard thing to teach. I mean, you can sit in a group and breathe with them all you want, but actual relaxing is very difficult. It's very difficult.
Lastly, Lale, before we sign off, what are you reading these days?
Oh, let's see. I'm sitting at my desk. What am I reading? I read, my friend Fozia Karimi is an Afghan woman, and she just wrote a beautiful book about her family's but their migration out of Afghanistan. She's one of 5 sisters, and she wrote a book about that called Under the Milky Way.
Right.
And it's stunning. And I've been reading a little bit every day, and it just is transportive. It has illustrations that she did herself, and she's changing the form of the novel in a way that I find very exciting. So I'm reading that, and I'm reading a lot of philosophy about time. So different philosophers about time. And I just finished reading Idris Shah, his book on teaching, because I think understanding teaching is very helpful for writing. They're both acts of seduction. So that is what I'm reading.
And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for being here, Lalin, talking to me, and for waking up at 7 a.m.
I was awake.
Okay, that's good. But I'm so glad I was able to talk to you, and you made such an enriching conversation.
It was lovely to speak with you too. And I'm so happy to finally get a chance to be part of the Lahore Literary Festival, which is, from afar at least, seems like an amazing time. And I can't wait to come in person one day.
We'd love to have you in person one day.
It would be great. Thank you so much. This was a lovely interview.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Have a good afternoon or evening. Goodbye.
Evening.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Goodbye.
bye now.